This is Dr. Churchill. We're in for another installment of Into the Final Frontier. We are still in the sea race part of our class, and today's lecture is going to be called Sea Paths to Everywhere. And this is the transition period. At first, the oceans were being explored tentatively, and ports were being found along Africa and in the Indian Ocean. And Christopher Columbus had already gone to the Americas. And at this point now, we see a flurry of activity in Europe, and a lot of other nations now start to join in. It's not just Portugal and Spain anymore in the European nations, but England and France and the Dutch also start to kick in, and some open seas competition begins. And the key here is that this vast expanse, like the picture I show behind me, which used to be viewed as some kind of infinite abyss that led nowhere, is seen as a superhighway. And the world is completely changed by that. And I love this part of the class in this regard, because this explosion of moving about the planet and using the sea as a conduit is no real different than the open expanse and vastness of space that is a conduit to getting to the planets in the solar system and eventually beyond. It has taken our minds a long time to get used to that idea. And so this transition period that we're going to talk about is very akin or similar to the transition period that I believe is going to be happening in the next 500 years for humanity as it goes out into the solar system. The question that we have is, do we want to do this in a way where we extend the past into the future so that we are about God, gold, and glory and exploitation and the taking of resources? Or are we going to change that and have more of the Star Trek vision of the universe, where we go out and we are somewhat respectful of the environment of space and the environment of these other planets and our own planet as well? So that is the big question that faces us. And as we go through these lectures, this one and the next two lectures, we're really going to see how aggressive and exploitive the human species was on the planet. So on the first slide here, we show basically an open ocean in the same way as the one I'm standing in front of. We've titled it Sea Paths to Everywhere. I'd like to read this line at the bottom here that says, "Never before had the arena of human experience been so suddenly or so drastically revised, and the earth became more than ever explorable." So that's from Daniel Boorstin and the Discoverers. And so we have this transition where the ocean is unconceived as a path to anywhere, that it was just a void, to basically, as I said earlier, a superhighway. This is very akin to the formless expanse that we see as outer space being around the earth. But soon, trade routes, or I would say navigational routes, will be developed out to the asteroids, out to Mars, and out to the outer solar system, and maybe even into the inner solar system. We will find ourselves having gateways. We're calling them gateways, but those would be basically space ports that are orbiting around some of these bodies that we can move on to the next stage in our travels through the solar system. As we go through this period of time, we're going to note that we start with exploration and the claiming of lands and the exploitations of lands. With time, it will transition into scientific exploration. In 1405 to 1433, we saw that Chang Ho had done extensive sailing around the Indian Ocean and the South Chinese Seas and Malaysia, and in a sense had explored that area tremendously. And the thing that was so dramatic was that we had 300 ships, some of them these treasure ships that were 800 feet long with 7 to 9 masts, and a expedition which included 30,000 men. It's always wondered what would happen if Chang Ho had continued those, but we had the political upheaval in China which reversed that, and it stopped. And we talked about the consequences of that for China. After Chang Ho, a long period of time went by, and the Portuguese inched their way down the coast of Africa until in 1488, Bartholomew Diaz discovered the end around on Africa and realized there was open ocean to get to the East Indies. Though he turned around and came home, as we know, Christopher Columbus was sitting on the dock when he came home with the news in Portugal, and he ran to Spain. And in 1492 to 1504, he went and he did his 4 voyages and discovered the New World. He was convinced he'd reached the islands outside of Asia, to the east of Asia, but in fact, that had yet to be determined, and he died believing that. Then in 1498, Vasco da Gama sails around to India, lands in Calicut, and then by 1515, we see that the Portuguese have set up all of their ports, they've taken all the ports down, they've pirated the entire monsoon marketplace trade that had been stable for 700 years and became exceedingly wealthy in this endeavor. Our story today is going to begin with Amerigo Vespucci. From 1499, a year after Vasco da Gama's first sailing, in fact, the same year that he returned from that first voyage, we're going to find out that there are at least 3 voyages of Vespucci in which he probes northward and southward along the American continents and is basically able to determine that he has discovered a continent. And that is one of the reasons why America is named after Amerigo. Fast forward about 15 years from Amerigo Vespucci's last voyage, and Ferdinand Magellan puts together 5 ships under the King of Spain and sails around the entire world. And this was an attempt to actually understand what lies beyond that line that the Pope drew for the Treaty of Tordesillas. What lies to the west of that line? And so that's what his voyage was all about. 1 ship made it back about 3 years later. We'll talk about a few of the other explorations and voyages in this talk, but I want to jump into the 1760s and talk about James Cook, because that's how much time went by, another 200 years before we really started to have people go out in the world and try to understand it from a scientific perspective. James Cook represents the first scientific voyages that took place, including, for example, measuring a transit of Venus across the sun on the other side of the planet. So the idea was that he could measure it on one side of the planet in the Pacific, and then astronomers in England could measure it in England on the other side of the planet. And by accounting for the different timings, they could actually measure the distance to Venus and the distance to the sun. Later on, about 50 to 70 years later, we see that Charles Darwin is a passenger on the Beagle, and he's a naturalist. And he collects data in South America and around the globe and comes back and develops his theory of natural selection. So our story is going to start with Amerigo Vespucci, and from there on we'll go to Ferdinand Magellan and talk about James Cook. Amerigo Vespucci was, like Christopher Columbus, an individual who grew up around the oceans, around port cities, and found them to be extremely exciting. And Vespucci himself grew up at the beginning of the Renaissance in Florence. This is a period of time when so many new ideas were coming in and changing, and the possibilities of growth and individuality had really captured the human spirit. He basically became a very curious and intellectually ambitious person. And this really drove him and is one of the reasons why he was such a good explorer of the American continent. By 1499, Vespucci's commercial and geographic interests had combined to draw him decisively into a new calling for exploring the world. It was obvious by then that the future of Spanish trade to the Orient would have to lie through the westward oceans. We're going to find out later on that Magellan was hired to find those paths. The Portuguese had preempted the route around Africa, but Columbus had shown that there are other lands to the west. So Vespucci was trying to fulfill Columbus's goal of reaching the west. You have to understand that he nor anybody else yet knew what they were dealing with. We know of at least 3 voyages that Vespucci made. Those 3 voyages happened in 1499, 1502, and 1503. It's not clear, but he may have made more voyages than that, but we don't seem to have clear records on that. Now I want to read you some of the words of Amerigo Vespucci. After we had sailed about 400 leagues continually along one coast, we concluded that this was mainland, that the said mainland is at the extreme limits of Asia to the eastward and at its beginning to the westward. So in a sense, he still had this idea that they were on the outskirts of Asia. Nobody knew about the Pacific Ocean and how vast it was. Vespucci records that the continent is highly populated. Sailing along the coast, we discovered each day an endless number of people and various languages. Now, this is one of the things that there's such a mismatch with the history as we understand it, or at least how it's been handed down to us. And that is that the Americas seemed to be an open land that was not highly populated by humans. But the fact of the matter is that it was highly populated. In fact, Vespucci records that millions and millions of people must be alive on this continent. And it was probably through disease that about 90% of them were killed off. Vespucci tried to find the Southern Star. The thing about the North is that navigators were able to use the North Star as a way to indicate their latitude on the planet. Vespucci realized that he had gone below the equator and now was unable to see the North Star. It was below his horizon. And so he was looking for a southern star so that he could then also gauge his latitude as he went south of the equator. Many of these sailors, especially the sea captains, were looking for some kind of historical fame. And Vespucci was no different. And what he wanted to do was be the person who found the southern star. Very desirous of being the author who should identify the polar star of the other hemisphere, I lost many a night's sleep contemplating the motion of the stars around the South Pole in order to record which of them had the least motion and was nearest to the pole. I want you to try to send yourself backward to these small ships that are out in the ocean, exposed to the elements, and being up late at night and thinking about these things. And these are individuals who are doing this in new lands, new areas of the world. So it must have been a very exciting and tantalizing experience. Again, we'll see that Vespucci speaks of a continent. We arrived at a new land which, for many reasons that are enumerated in what follows, we observe to be a continent. He followed the south coast. He'd gone to Rio de Janeiro, and he'd gone further south. We navigated into the southern hemisphere for 9 months and 27 days, never seeing the Arctic pole or even Ursa Major and Minor. Now, Ursa Major and Minor are constellations of the Big Bear and the Little Bear, Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. I was on the side of the antipodes. My navigation extended through 1/4 of the world. The inhabitants were numerous, yet the infinite variety of trees, sweet-smelling fruits and flowers, and display of brilliantly plumed birds stimulated fancies of the terrestrial paradise. This is very interesting because you get this sense of this explosion of sensory smells and feelings that had come to these people. What should I tell the magnitude of wild animals, the abundance of pumas and panthers and wild cats, none of those like in Spain, but of the antipodes, of so many wolves, reindeer, monkey, and felines. Here's a situation where he's south of the pole. These were, in a sense, heretical conclusions because the Roman Catholic Church still had a firm grip on Europe, and it was their doctrine that the earth was flat and that there was a wall of fire around the equator. Now that had slowly been erased because these explorers demonstrated it wasn't there, but still remained was the idea that nobody could live upside down. Vespucci actually challenges the idea of Noah's Ark because he sees so many new species and so numerous of new species that he doesn't believe that a single ark could have contained all of the species on the planet. Now, by the time that Vespucci was done with his third voyage, several years later, a few years later, in 1502, we get the Cantino map of the world. And you can see here, if I move my arrow, we have the first three worlds. We have Asia, we have Africa, and we have Europe. And then we have the new fourth world, which is the New World. And you can see here are the islands of which Christopher Columbus explored, mapped out pretty well. And here is the coast of South America that is now mapped out quite well by Vespucci. He also did some explorations along the northern coast of North America, and there was some indication of some kind of coastline here as well. And so we can start to see our understanding of the planet unfold a little bit. What is missing still, you will notice, is a vast Pacific Ocean. In 1520, we see another similar map. This is now 16 years after Vespucci's sailings. And in fact, Vespucci died, I believe, in 1512, so he's passed away at this stage. Now you can see here what is considered to be the coastlines of South America. Here is Cuba. It's not very far that there's a westward passage to Asia and then to the Spice Islands. So this map is really suggestive that you should be able to sail around these continents, which don't seem at this stage to be completely blocking the way. You could find those passages, and then from there you could make your way to the Spice Islands. We will find soon that the British and the French were very interested in finding a north passage shortly after Magellan had found a southern passage. I'd like to remind you of the Treaty of Tordesillas and the Cold War between Spain and Portugal. That began in the 1490s, as we know, but it was alive and well still into the 1520s. As you will recall, Cortez had taken out the Aztec Empire around 1515, and then the Incas and the Mayans followed there shortly. So by 1530, they basically had taken over the American continent. So Spain understood that the lands westward of the line or the demarcation of the Treaty of Tordesillas, that those lands belonged to them, and they wanted to continue to explore those. The Spanish Emperor Charles V, he actually decided that he was going to put together an expedition to go find these lands and obtain the claim for the Spanish crown. For that expedition, he actually chose a Portuguese captain by the name of Ferdinand Magellan. This is the story of the circumnavigation of the globe, of the first circumnavigation of the globe. Magellan, stretched by any imagination, any seafarer's accomplishments by orders of magnitude. He excelled da Gama, he excelled Columbus, he excelled Vespucci. He left with 5 ships out of Spain. His goal was to find the western passage around the new American continent and make his way to the Spice Islands and claim them then for Spain. His goal was to find where the Portuguese will end and where the Spanish will end on the other side of the world, which we know became the Treaty of Zaragoza. This is the path that he sailed along the south, and then he found his passageway, which are called the Straits of Magellan. Then they entered the Pacific. Now, by this time, he had lost one of his ships that had sank, and then the other ship had departed in the middle of the night while they were actually making their way through the Straits of Magellan. When they were lost sight, that captain took his ship and sailed back. So entering the Pacific, Magellan only had 3 of his ships remaining. Now, they gave this ocean the name the Pacific because it was so calm. They had, I think, something like 3 weeks with no wind. And of course, that was the only way that their ships could be propelled. So they really were just sitting in the ocean, this very mill-pondy, quiet ocean, for weeks on end until they got their wind back up. And then they started to make their way into the Pacific Ocean, and they were astonished at how vast it was. Now, we all heard about Magellan and his straits and the fact that he discovered this passageway through the southern tip of the continent of South America. Hopefully you will read Daniel Borston's book, The Discoverers. He really describes how difficult and how arduous this process was. In addition to all of the trials and tribulations that Magellan had with mutiny and defecting captains, He also had situations like scurvy and health issues and whatnot. They eventually made their way to the East Indies. And when they got there, it turns out that Magellan got killed. So Magellan didn't make it all the way home. It turns out that Magellan died in this area right in here. There was a dispute between two kings, and Magellan sided with one of them. And when they went to attack the other tribes, it turned out that they were overwhelmed and Magellan got killed. So now his crew wants to continue on and finish their mission to circumnavigate the globe. One of the ships was not very seaworthy, and it basically sank. So now they're down to one ship. And this one ship now has to traverse the areas that are controlled by the Portuguese. This is a ship under the Spanish flag. This is not going to go well for them. As you know, the Portuguese have complete control of this area throughout here, and they have complete control along the coast of Africa. They wanted to steer clear of that, and so they kept to the south, but they actually touched base at the Cape of Good Hope, and it turned out that a lot of the men were imprisoned. Eventually, some 18 men were able to make it all the way back to Spain. 250 men left on 5 ships, and about 3 years later, 18 men returned on 1 ship. So once Magellan had circumnavigated the globe, well, technically not Magellan, but since his mission had circumnavigated the globe, more maps were developed. There was a flurry of map making, which is a very important thing. It's how we organize our understanding of the places we know, the places we've been, and the places we don't know that we can continue to explore. As early as 1507, which is still before Magellan, they dropped their great plan to make another version of Ptolemy's great map from his geography book, which, as we know, was from 150 CE, with some annotations to it. Instead, they dropped that whole idea and they decided to make a brand new map, which they called the Cosmography Introductio. On it, they put the American continent for the first time. And of course, they had to name it. One of the map makers, Martin Waldseemüller, casually made an observation. Now these parts of the Earth, Europe, Africa, and Asia, have been more extensively explored, and a fourth part has been discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, as will be described in what follows. Inasmuch as both Europe and Asia received their names from women, I see no reason why anyone should justly object to calling this part Amerige, the land of Amerigo, its discoverer, a man of great ability. In the end, that was changed to America to make it a feminine gender name. This here is the original text that was written to describe the naming of the continent of America. Here's the Cosmography Introductio, 1507. It's a very famous map. I've actually seen it in person in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. The thing that's interesting about this map is this exaggerated peninsula over here in Southeast Asia. But as you can see, we start to see the full extent of South America and the beginnings of North America, and of course, the islands that were discovered by Columbus. And you'll notice that Iceland is here. Iceland was well known, even though you don't hear about it talked about in history very much. Even Christopher Columbus had sailed to Iceland decades before he sailed to the New World. Now, some 20 years after Magellan's crew had sailed around the world, we begin to have more explorations and start to fill out the western side of the American continent. And so by 1538, we show both a North American continent and a South American continent. And we have this beautiful map here called the Orbis Terrae. The thing that was interesting about this period is that the printing press had been developed. And so these maps could be printed and now they could be distributed to the masses. So it became common knowledge for common people, I should say, to have this knowledge of the new fourth world and for them also to understand the extent and shape of the world that they lived in. It was transforming. With time, the maps became more sophisticated. You can see that the extent or exaggeration of what's happening in Southeast Asia has been cleaned up. The number of islands here are being put together. The number of islands here are being charted quite well. We can see that Australia is somehow connected to a great southern continent. It's not quite understood yet at this point in time that this is actually another continent in its own right. We see Madagascar very clearly. Africa is extant, and in the Americas, we don't quite understand the shape of South America yet, and we have an exaggerated sensibility for how extended the North American continent is. And we don't understand, of course, what's going on in the North Polar regions. But the interesting thing here is this huge southern continent that was really terra incognita, but then put on the maps as being a large landmass. And the reasons were simple. The idea was that the Earth could not be out of balance. There was some sensibility that there had to be as much land in the south as there was in the north. So they put the southern continent here in order to balance the world. But scientifically, they did not know it was there. Now, before we move on to the explorations of Captain Cook, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an overview of the activity that happened and the fact that some other nations kicked in and became competitive with trying to find these sea routes. So if we back up again to Bartholomew Dias, he sailed from Portugal, came down in 1487, 1488, and found the passageway, but was unable to complete that mission and then returned home. We have Columbus, who sailed for Spain in 1492, 1502. And here is the path of Columbus. We see him coming out here in 1492, and he made 4 voyages. And then sailing for England, Cabot sailed for England. This is in 1497, 1498. Now you'll see we haven't spoke of the English during the late 1490s, but in fact, they had set sail and were looking for a northern passage to find a way to get to the Spice Islands. Vasco da Gama sailed at the same time as Cabot in 1497 to 1498. And we all know about the sailing of Vasco da Gama along this blue line here and his return. Vespucci, we just discussed him, his 3 voyages that happened from 1497 to 1503 along here. They're not showing all of them. He obviously went down here as well. In 1519 to 1522, we have Magellan, who has come through down here, gone through the Straits, sailed across the Pacific Ocean, met his fate in the Philippines. His crew then headed south to come back around and returned 3 years later. Then we have Cartier from 1543 to 1535, who was sailing for France, and he was up here looking for a northern passage. What we're going to find is the French did have quite a foothold in northern Canada. In fact, we all know about Quebec and how they speak French. Many of us have heard of Sir Francis Drake, I believe, who from 1579 to 1580, and you can see that he came around South America, came up North America, and then headed across and made his way to the Philippines, eventually also circumnavigating the globe. And then Hudson, from 1609 to 1610, sailed to the north here for the Netherlands. He was looking for passages to get around the north, and of course found the Hudson Bay and the New York area. It turns out that this became a hotbed for competition between all of these nations in the next centuries. Now we're going to talk about Captain Cook, Captain James Cook. I'm calling this part the Ardors of Negative Discovery after Daniel Borston's chapter of the same name. This is a situation where an expedition was put together for strictly scientific purposes. They wanted to do some botany, astronomy, a lot of geography, and understand where the extent of the southern continent was, and also medical explorations. His 3 major voyages were from 1768 to 71, 72 to 75, and 76 to 79. So these actually happened during the American Revolution. This is a quote from Daniel Borston here at the bottom. And effectively, it's a statement that Captain Cook really had to struggle with something called negative discovery. It's one thing to find something. It's another thing to demonstrate that that something is not there. Their goal was to find what is the extent of the southern continent. It wasn't like they were trying to prove that it wasn't there, but they had to prove, where did it begin? You have to continue to scour and continue to scour and continue to scour until you find the edge of it. So you're constantly confirming it not being there, confirming it not being there. But when do you stop confirming that it's not there anymore if you never do find it? It's a very exhausting exercise. You can see here that I've colored the 3 voyages, red, green, and blue. And so the first voyage, coming from England, came around the southern continent. It actually came along the coast of Australia and then came back and circumnavigated the globe. In 1772, this is the voyage which he actually tried very hard to find the extent of the southern continent. You can see here that he came down to the south, emerging on this side over here, sailing in the eastward direction, trying to find the extent of this continent, okay? Stopping for some supplies here, meandering around to do some science, and then heading back and trying to find where the edge of this continent was. For his third voyage in 76, he was instructed to find the extent of the northern continents and possibly a land passage around North America. And so you can see he came out this way, came around, went up, and sailed in this area looking for those passages. And you'll notice that he came to Hawaii. And it turns out that on his third voyage in Hawaii is when he met his demise. Voyage 1 is when he was going to go to Tahiti and measure the occultation of Venus in front of the sun. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a way of determining the distance between Venus, the Earth, and the sun. In Voyage 2, this is, as I said before, where he goes to try to find the southern continent. He really went very deep into the southern polar regions. There's a famous quote that I like to read here, which talks about how he pushed and pushed and pushed southernward to find land and not just fields of ice. He eventually failed to find what he considered the continent. In this field, we counted 97 ice hills and mountains, many of them vastly large. I will not say it was impossible anywhere to get in among this ice, but I will assert that the bare attempting of it would be a very dangerous enterprise, and what I believe no man in my situation would have thought. I, whose ambition leads me not only farther than any other man has been before me, but as far as I think it is possible for man to go, was not sorry to meeting this interruption, as in some measure I was relieved. We were relieved of the dangers and hardships inseparable with the navigation of the southern polar regions. Since, therefore, we could not proceed 1 inch further south, no other reason need be assigned for our tacking and stretching back to the north, being at the time at the latitude of minus 71 degrees 10 minutes longitude, 106 degrees 54 minutes west. This is a very famous quote. And in fact, the part that I've written in red here is one of the most inspiring sirens of all explorers to have experienced the sensation that Captain Cook must have had when he wrote those words, is to be out at the very edge where no human has been before. And in fact, some of the moon explorers have quoted this quote on their journey to the moon. And we'll find out later when we talk about the space program that the Apollo 15 command module was named the Endeavour. And the captain of that space capsule was David Scott. And David Scott understood that his mission, Apollo 15, was the first science mission to go to the moon, transcended from flags and footsteps on the moon to doing science on the moon. And so in reverence to Captain Cook and his being the first science expeditions, he named his ship after Captain Cook's ship from the second voyage, the Endeavour. On Captain Cook's third voyage, Cook did a lot of medical research, even though he wasn't a doctor, but he experimented with how can I help my crew not struggle and suffer from scurvy. Cook is recognized for what he did to improve the health and save the lives of men at sea. He did more than any other explorer in the sailing days for long ocean voyages to cure the curse of the seaman, scurvy, the lethargy, the anemia, the bleeding gums, the loosened teeth, the stiffness of the joints, and the slow healing. And on Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope that we've talked about many times, he left with 170 men, but 100 of them were taken by scurvy. And it's a very painful and slow demise. By enforcing cleanliness and running experiments with oranges and lemons and lime, so I can say that the space capsule contains Cook's limes, these types of fruits were good for ingesting vitamin C and the types of nutrients that were required to fight scurvy. And in fact, he lost very few men to scurvy, and it was a huge boon to sea expeditions that now men wouldn't die basically like flies. I'd like to bring this up because one of the most difficult things about going out into space is the health effects. We struggle with bone loss, and we also struggle with the loss of white blood cells when we're in space. The other thing is that in space, there's a lot of radiation, and you're exposed to that, and that can actually cause cancer. We have a lot of medical problems that we have to overcome in space, and cracking those are just as important as Cook's cracking scurvy. As I mentioned, Cook did not complete his third voyage. When he was in Hawaii, it turned out that he got in a scuffle with the king of one of the islands. And it turned out that some natives had stolen one of the small schooners, and Cook wanted it back. He went onto the beach, and at that time, things had gone sour, and Cook did not survive the exchange. There's a lot of different stories about exactly what happened there. And if you are interested, you could watch John Green's episode on Captain Cook, his crash course on YouTube. And you'll find out that there's at least 3 different theories for why Captain Cook did not survive this exchange. The interesting thing was that the natives had a great deal of respect for Captain Cook, and they had prepared his body as if he was a local king, and they gave his remains back to the crew so they could bury Captain Cook using his own customs and honors. I would like to wrap up with just trying to draw you into this world. It's a very exciting period of time, in the sense like the Wild West was. Very dangerous time, away from home, strange places, not knowing if you'll ever return to see anybody you know again. A very exposed existence. So I would like to just show some pictures and just try to see if you can imagine yourself living in these pictures. So here's one. You can sort of feel the cool breeze, the sense of salt in the air, the exposure to the wind, the lapping of the waves on the hulls, and maybe you can imagine hearing the birds. This was home, and this was a situation where you were exposed to this continually. This was your existence. I love this picture because this ship is just a technological wonder, a powerhouse for harnessing the sea, for harnessing the winds of the seas. I want you to imagine if you were a crew and your job was to climb up on these masts and unfurl these sails, tie them down, to store them, to clean them, to treat them. Everything that was involved, every time you had to set the sails up or bring the sails down. Out there in the ocean, maybe in extremely rough seas when you have to hurry and it's raining and storming and you have to, bring the sails down and you're up there 40 stories above the ocean, being waved back and forth through tens of feet, maybe 50 feet from breast to breast. Every now and again, you come home after you've been out in the ocean, or you come to a strange harbor that you've never been before, you anchor, again, you're out, you're exposed by the sea, and await you is some strange port city, different peoples, different customs, perhaps you're part of a war party, and you're there to fight. Who knows? But strange, faraway port cities must have been a common occurrence and a very tantalizing experience and feeling. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about competition between these nations to grab lands and control sea routes. And really, in the 1600s, in a sense, it was open season on the ocean. If you ran into another ship that was flying under a different flag, there was no qualms about opening fire. You had a situation where it was open warfare on the oceans. And in a sense, you could say that the world was at war for the first time in the 1600s. It was truly global. I can't overstate how maritime power was the key to world domination and commercial success. Later, we will show that the British Empire covered the entire globe, okay? And why was that? Because they had the most powerful navy. Powerful navies are what created the world we live in today. The open seas, they were hostile. Ports, trade routes, colonies, and slave trades, all of this were precious commodities and were struggled for keeping or struggled for the taking. Here's just a small gallery of maritime battles. You can see that these battles were up close and personal. You can imagine the extremely loud sounds of gunfire and cannon explosions. Not to mention the idea of a cannonball ripping through the hull, splintering the wood, scaring you to death, and maybe even exploding. The whole idea was that it was kill or be killed in some of these battles. And so, in a sense, are you going to live another day or are you going to just die? But if you do survive, then you're going to get your just reward. You are going to basically vanquish your enemy and take what was theirs. Here's another extremely, I think, emotional picture of a very up close and personal battle. And imagine again now, you can't even breathe or see in front of you from the smoke from the cannon and the fire. I don't know if you've ever heard of Davy Jones' locker, but if you were to fall in the sea and die, or if you were to have a burial at sea, they call the bottom of the ocean Davy Jones' locker. Here's another epic battle that we see. And what I want to point out is that it was during these types of battles that we had the exchange of power. Remember, I said that the whole world was forged by these naval battles and by navies, and that the winner then controlled the outcome. And so you could have the exchange of one port from one country's power to another country's power. This was a period of time when might makes right. So that completes our lecture for today, talking about Vespucci and Magellan and Cook and how many of the expeditions became scientific with time, and a little bit of coverage of some old paintings in order to help draw you into what life must have been like in those days. And I love the idea of you trying to do that, because in the next 500 years, it's going to be like the Wild West in space. And we don't know whether we're going to continue this model of battling it out with each other for different ports on asteroids or on planets or orbital rights. You know, who's going to be able to orbit? You can imagine there's one country has orbital control of Mars, and another country is going to come along and say, we want control of Mars, and blast all their satellites and blast all of their gateway space stations out of orbit and take control. Are we going to be like that? Or are we going to go out there and try to work together? So when we meet next time, we're going to be talking about the competition for basically riches beyond compare by exploiting the new world.